warmly welcome to the Pufendorf Lectures 2018. I'm Johannes Persson, Dean of the Joint Faculties of Humanities and Theology. Samuel Pufendorf, 1632 to 1694, the famous theorist of natural law in 17th century Europe, was a professor at Lund University from 1668 to 1676. Lund University was founded in the end of 1666, but the inauguration did not take place until late in 68, almost exactly 350 years from now. Hence, Pufendorf was one of its very first professors. Initially a project designed to make this part of Sweden Swedish, the university has evolved from just a few hundred students and professors being paid with meat and grain into its present form with around 42,000 students, and a position we are proud of in terms of excellence in international teaching and research. The Pufendorf Lectures have taken place yearly since 2003, when Professor Margaret Bowden became our first lecturer. Now, in 2018, we proudly present our 16th lecturer, Professor Simon Blackburn. Simon Blackburn is one of the UK's leading philosophers. He retired as Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge in 2011 and remains a distinguished research professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's also a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a member of the Professorate of New College of the Humanities. Professor Simon Blackburn has been, and still is, extremely important to philosophy in our times, and perhaps in particular to new students of philosophy. Like few others, he has, over the decades, consistently produced influential philosophical work on important philosophical problems and different philosophical problems. Blackburn has written and edited profound and much read books, sometimes in the form of introductions to difficult philosophical problems. Many of them have functioned as the students' entering wedge into philosophy, as a kind of philosophy's paradigms or exemplars. Here are just a few of the many books. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, Essays in Quasi-Realism, Being Good, A Short Introduction to Ethics, Truth, A Guide, Think, A Compelling Introduction to Philosophy. Professor Blackburn has also written numerous important and highly cited research articles, like Spreading the Word, Groundings in the Philosophy of Language, Thought Without Representation, The Individual Strikes Back, Filling in Space, Supervenience Revisited, How to be an Ethical Anti-Realist. We could go on listing Professor Blackburn's work and importance almost forever. However, it's time to focus on the present 4 lectures. Simon Blackburn is going to give 4 lectures centering on the theme Truth and Post-Truth. Today, the title of the lecture is Truth and Anxiety. Tomorrow, Peirce, James, and Pragmatism. Then follows the genuine limits of reason, and finally, Truth in a difficult climate. Professor Blackburn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very. Can you all hear me? Oh, good. Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you to the university for inviting me to give this lecture series. It's rather daunting to be giving a lecture series in honor of a philosopher who worked basically 350 years ago, because most of us have very little prospect of being remembered in 350 years, even if the civilization continues that long, which sometimes seems unlikely. The impetus for these lectures was I was asked to review 3 books in 2017, all of which had post-truth in the title. I was asked to do that by one of the United Kingdom's best attempts at an intellectual magazine. It's called Prospect. Some of you may have heard of it. And I was a bit perplexed about this, but suddenly the idea of post-truth was very much in the air. These three books, each of them in some ways picked up the idea. The reason it was in the air is that the Oxford Dictionary, that every year the Oxford Dictionaries of English choose a word of the year. And the word of the year for 2016 was post-truth. And this was the Oxford definition of post-truth. It was relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And I started to puzzle about this and wonder about it and wonder why it was suddenly so much in the air. Well, of course, I knew something of why it was in the air. It was in the air because of the ghastly Brexit referendum, which happened in the United Kingdom, and because of President Trump. The idea is that objective facts somehow have lost traction. They've lost importance in public debate compared to appeals to emotion and personal belief. Well, I understood that much, but I didn't really understand quite the detail that these people were worried about. So what was the anxiety exactly? And it seemed to me you might distinguish a number of different strands to the anxiety. As it stands, I don't think the Oxford definition is terribly helpful because public opinion has always been shaped by appeals to emotion and personal belief. Propaganda of all sorts, political propaganda, is the art of mobilizing people's emotions in favor of some policy that you feel ought to be pursued. And personal belief, well, if you don't personally believe in an objective fact, then the objective fact isn't going to influence your behavior. It might be an objective fact that there's a bus bearing down on me. But if I don't believe that there's a bus bearing down on me, if it's not a personal belief of mine, I'm not going to jump out of the way. It's only when I perceive the bus and believe that there's a bus that it influences my behavior. So in a sense, personal belief is always involved in anything that influences anybody's behavior. It's not, as it were, that you can bypass, in general, our cognitive faculties, whether conscious or unconscious, and get people to behave as if there's a bus bearing down on them, without getting them to believe that there's a bus bearing down on them. I won't believe that, I don't know, Brazil nuts cause cancer. Sorry, I won't behave as if Brazil nuts cause cancer by avoiding eating them, unless you can get me to believe that Brazil nuts cause cancer, and that might just about influence me against eating them. So it wasn't clear to me that the change or the circumstances, the special circumstances that the Oxford definition purports to identify are in fact special at all. It looks to me as though in order to shape opinion, you've got to change people's personal beliefs, and in order to change opinion politically, so that you've got public opinion changing, you're very likely to have to appeal to people's emotions. The first book on rhetoric was, of course, put together by Aristotle, so it's over 2,000 years since people realized that, as well as presenting facts, you've got to present the facts in a way that gets hold of people's emotions and passions. So, as I say, that's led me to wonder what particular form the modern circumstances were supposed to be taking. Well, I had to work that out for myself because none of the three books I was reviewing helped very, very much. So I thought the first thought was that people no longer trust their sources, or can no longer trust their sources, or perhaps should no longer trust their sources. That is, people worry about the cacophony of the web, for example, that you can go on and find almost anything said. Very few sources are relatively trustworthy. And it's certainly true that if you can't trust any sources, then you have to abandon any hope of adopting a unique, rational belief about the area. If all I have is that A comes in and tells me P, and B comes in and tells me not P, and I have no particular reason to trust A or to trust B, then on that basis I can't form a judgment about whether P or not P. I might have other reasons for forming a judgment depending on the issue, but as far as those sources of information go, they cancel each other out. There's nothing to be gained until I can generate an asymmetry between them, finding that one of them has been through a fact checker, that the other one hasn't, that the fact checker isn't just another political ally of the first, and so on. But of course all that takes time and effort, and usually we don't have the time and effort to spend, and so we have to flick to the next page. We can't trust untrustworthy sources. And that generates a genuine epistemological problem. That is, we can't know what's true if we can't abandon sources indicating what's true. Our sources sometimes, of course, are simply our senses. You can go see what's true for yourself. But our senses, of course, give us a very limited perspective on the world. You at present can see what's going on in this lecture room, but you can't at present see what's going on even in the rest of Lund, let alone the rest of Sweden, the rest of the world. So your senses need supplementation. You'll have used your senses on previous occasion. You might have good memories. You can remember what you saw, what you heard. But by and large, for huge swathes of information, you've got to rely on other people. You've got to rely on testimony. It's only recently, actually, that philosophers in my tradition, in the analytic tradition, have begun to highlight the importance of testimony. There is an interesting historic reason for that. John Locke, a good Protestant, as you are in Sweden, I suppose, all good Protestants, the point about Protestantism, one of the points, is that you have yourself a direct relationship with God. It's not mediated by authority, by the church, by priests and so on. And that's good, I think. But Locke took it to a further degree and thought that other people's opinions couldn't be really parts of your rational belief system. If you accepted an opinion from somebody else, then that was, as it were, second rate, or even third rate, or even not to be admitted at all. You ought to see for yourself. You ought to have a direct relationship with the fact that you believed in. Well, that's an extreme sort of Protestant ideal, or rather it's a transposition of the religious or theological ideal of Protestantism. But of course it's completely unrealistic. You rely on people's testimony for virtually everything you claim to know. You rely on it for your belief that the earth goes round the sun. You rely on it for your belief that the world is some 14 billion years old and that the earth itself is some 4 billion years old and that people didn't coexist with dinosaurs. I hope you all believe that. If I was lecturing in the United States, I couldn't even hope that, but here I can, I hope. But you only believe it because you've been told that that's the scientific consensus. You're probably, unless you're geologists or cosmologists, you're probably not part of the scientific consensus. You haven't seen much of that for yourself, but you've been told that that's the scientific consensus. That is itself, of course, a piece of testimony. So, of course, your epistemological situation is indeed dire if you can't trust any sources. Fortunately, you can. We all think that some sources are reliable on some issues, and we know of no countervailing evidence. We haven't detected untrustworthiness in many sources. I take most of my news from one of the 2 or 3 quality newspapers in the United Kingdom, or the BBC, and they have reputations for quality, reputations for truth-telling. They're the first up to the plate when they know or it's pointed out that they've made a mistake, they acknowledge it, and so on. So they have signals of trustworthiness which they give out, and I rely on those signals. An arbitrary or anonymous or troll factory on the web doesn't have any of that, so of course I take no notice of it. Well, it's all very well saying we are in a bad epistemological state, that the trustworthiness has become rather iffy. Actually, in some respects, I think that's a rubbish idea, because in some respects our epistemological situation is much better than it's ever been. That is, although the web is full of misinformation, it's usually misinformation about politicians, about celebrities, about things that people have an emotional investment in. But if you want to find out, I don't know, the population of Sweden, which is something I looked up quite recently, you go to Wikipedia, and pretty much it's okay. You can take an awful lot from Wikipedia before you fall flat on your face. So we can find out more quickly than ever before. So it seems to be exaggerating the downside to think that the web has introduced a particularly dire and wicked epistemological situation for us. In many respects, as I say, I think it's improved our epistemological situations. We can know more, we have more at our fingertips. Furthermore, it seemed to me odd to think that these epistemological worries related to the very idea of truth itself. If anything, they presuppose that we've got rather a robust conception of truth, because it's a robust conception of truth, the idea that there is a fact of the matter, which leads you to worry about whether a source is trustworthy, on what the fact of the matter is. So, suppose I have some source which I regard as doubtful. My wife tells me the score in the latest test match that England is playing at present. Well, I know my wife has virtually zero interest in cricket. It would seem to me amazing that she'd listened to a commentary, or if she had, that she'd remembered it accurately. So it's a source I wouldn't put too much credence in. I wouldn't be 100% confident that England was all out for 51 or something if my wife told me. But my lack of confidence goes along with a very robust sense there is a fact of the matter whether England was out for 51. Sorry, 51 is a notoriously low score in test cricket, for those of you who aren't quite up on the rules of that particular game. I know that I could check it. I know I could check it instantly. I can go to the BBC and find out what the test score is. I can listen actually to live commentary. I can update my knowledge of the test score minute by minute if I choose to, if I've got nothing better to do. So there's nothing in a situation in which you're worried about the trustworthiness of your sources is not a situation in which the very idea of truth has somehow become problematized or doubtful. So I wondered whether there was something else going on in this idea of post-truth. If it's not an epistemological worry about the trustworthiness of sources, what might it be? Well, one thing it might be is it could be a failure of worries about our categories, worries about the concepts which we bring to events in order to handle them, to describe them, to express our information about them. And the idea might be that somehow there's a debasement of the vocabulary with which we habitually form public opinion, with which public opinion is formed. This was a worry voiced very, very eloquently and very often by George Orwell, a famous writer, particularly He went to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and he saw in a sense, the first results of modern propaganda methods. Propaganda could be spread for the first time by the radio, by instant dissemination of printed material, and so on. And he thought that the way things were presented in the different propagandas of the different sides in the Spanish Civil War amounted to a kind of fog, not a fog of misinformation, so much as a sort of fog of failures to provide information at all, failures even to engage with sensible descriptions of the world. It's very difficult to make that idea precise. I mean, there have always been worries. I think I've got a quotation here. I can't remember where they put it in. Yes, here's the first worry of this sort, voiced in the Greek historian Thucydides, talking not about the Spanish Civil War, but about the Peloponnesian War of several centuries BC. Words had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Cautious plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. So Thucydides there is lamenting the way in which vocabularies get, in a sense, moulded and twisted by the events of a time. And Orwell was making exactly the same lament about the way in which language got co-opted by the participants in the Spanish Civil War. Well, worries about vocabulary and its adequacy are as old as philosophy. Aristotle talks of a contemporary of Plato's, a chap called Cratylus. One of the dialogues is named after him, who may have been a teacher of Plato's. And Cratylus became so worried about the adequacies of vocabulary to fact that he gave up talking. And he eventually was reduced to communicating just by wagging his finger. That was all he was prepared to do, to offer signals to other people. Well, we might think that's a bit extreme, but there are good examples, and a good modern example from a very different kind of source than the fog of war, the fog of propaganda, rival propagandas and rival political claims, is the vocabularies used, and I've chosen the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder of the American Psychiatric Association. It's always known as DSM. And it's the Bible of the American psychological industry and other countries as well. It's widely used in Britain. Well, it's gone through 5 editions. DSM-1 contained 132 pages, DSM-5 contained 947. Now that suggests that we can have or describe 7 times as many psychiatric illnesses as were known 50 or 70 years ago. So there's been a multiplication of about 7. And of course, there are huge controversies over the inflation. The charges thrown at DSM include allegations of secrecy, accusation of conflicts of interest, charges of medicalizing normality, and other claims of poor methodology. You've probably all heard of things like attention deficit disorder. This is supposed to characterize certain very naughty children. Well, I've no doubt that there are naughty children, and I've no doubt that there's something that could be improved about their mental states to stop them being naughty. Maybe also there's something that could be improved in their environment to stop them being naughty, but that's another matter. But is it a psychiatric disorder? Well, I don't think so, until you get extremes. get the children that take out the kitchen knives and try to kill their siblings and so on. And that's not an attention deficit. That's a sheer bloody moral deficit. So that's an example of the kind of thing where you put a label on something and it becomes put into a certain category, mental disorder, therefore treatable, therefore drugs, therapies, an industry of paying attention to the child or other patient. And of course, the more things of that kind you can find, the more drugs you sell, the more your therapies are in demand, and so forth. So there's commercial motivations for inflating the variety of human syndromes which get medicalized. And so that's an example where you have to be careful about the categories which are applied, and you have to recognize that there's a political and commercial motivation for twisting the vocabularies one way or the other. I called it childhood naughtiness. I'm sure an American psychiatrist would say that's just terribly wishy-washy. The real thing is attention deficit disorder, and that's a disorder, and it needs, well, in some cases, many cases, it needs a Class A drug, Ritalin, which is widely prescribed for it. So you, and I could describe that as turning children into drug addicts, which would be another, as you can see, another categorization which has a practical and political and moral overtone. So vocabularies are important, and people like Thucydides and Orwell are right to tell us to be alert to difficulties in being sure that our categories are adequate to the issues in hand. For a more slightly lighter example of this, a more amusing example, I hope, about 30 years ago, with my usual immaculate sense of timing, just 2 years before keyhole surgery came in, I wrecked a cartilage in one knee, and so I had to face quite a serious operation of getting the cartilage out. And I didn't react very well to it. It turned out I was in bed for a couple of days and throwing a great temperature, and everybody, all the doctors were rather worried, and my wife was very worried, and so on and so on. So after this had gone on for a couple of days, I kind of lugged myself down to the end of the bed where they put case notes. I don't know whether they do this in Sweden, but in hospitals in Britain, often there's a sort of chart at the end of your bed with your case notes on it, so any passing doctor can see what's supposed to be wrong with you. So I went and looked at my case notes, and it said that I'd got PUO. Doctors like acronyms. So I thought, oh, well, at least they know what's wrong with me. It's PUO. And eventually I had a friend in the same college, a doctor. When I'd recovered, which I did, I said, by the way, Alex, what's PUO? And he said, oh, well, P is always pyrexia, which is fever. And UO means unknown origin. So what I had was a fever of unknown origin, which I knew anyhow. So the idea that just by labeling something you gain a piece of knowledge about it is also a mistake. And of course, one of the things that philosophers of language should be interested in, Plato was certainly interested in it. I can't say it's been an enormous 20th or 21st century focus of research, but I think it might be, is the difference between labeling something and describing it. If you just put a label or a tag on something, you don't describe it, you just tag it. If you go to prison, you might be given a number, 143 or something. That's not a description of anything, it's just a tag. It enables other people to find you if they're told to find prisoner 143, but it doesn't tell them anything about you. Similarly, somebody could have told a nurse, say, find the patient with PUO in his case notes, mentioning the phrase, but they're then just mentioning the tag that's been used. They're not using a description, as if they said find the patient with red spots or find the patient whose hair is falling out or something. So, you need to understand the difference between a label and a description. Some of the philosophers I'm going to talk about, particularly next week, next day, tomorrow, the pragmatists give us an avenue into that, and one which I'm going to commend to you, but that's jumping the gun for the moment. Okay, so I thought a better way of framing a worry about truth was not in terms of the likely trustworthiness of our sources or the presence of sources that we can trust in the modern world, but was whether the vocabulary in which various things are discussed is somehow distorting. It's using distorted categories or categories that have been formed by improper commercial or political pressures and that we do well to be suspicious of. And I suspect that's often true. If you read the propaganda, say of, one that's on my mind at present is Brexiteers. The Brexiteers in Britain, their propaganda is frequently framed in terms of an alleged glorious past, glorious imperial or colonial past, which somehow, in a buccaneering spirit, we can go and recapture. Well, the word buccaneer is not a very good one. Buccaneers were criminals who happened to operate at sea. It's not very. It's not a very nice model to follow, but also, of course, largely the glorious imperial and colonial past is a myth and not one that we should do very well to try to recapture. So again, you get words used to induce bad ideas, bad fantasies, and on the back of those, bad policies. Okay, so that's, I think, a genuine worry and something to alert us to. Again, I doubt whether it's any worse now than it was in the time of Thucydides or the Spanish Civil War. I don't think there's anything happened in 2016 to make vocabularies worse. Well, the third interpretation of post-truth anxiety, I think, is I mean, of course, and this comes back to the anonymity of posting things on Facebook or on the web in general, when it is anonymous. You've got the absence of reputation effects. And this connects with the lack of trustworthiness, as I've already talked about, but it also, I think, connects to a lack of shame. And this is, I think, arguably a modern phenomenon. Obviously, one of the prime motivations, or prime, I won't say motivation, but for reasons I'll come to, but one of the prime indicators of trustworthiness in, say, a small community, if you imagine the classical village, in a village community, you've got to be trustworthy, or at least the penalties for not being trustworthy are much more immediate and possibly quite devastating. That is, if you're in a village and you are known to be a liar, then of course your standing in the village is going to be poor, your capacity to induce other people to cooperate with you is likely to be low, and the reputation effect is likely to be very serious. You're not likely to be able to hide it. And so shame, the possibility of being shamed and the internalization of that possibility is a very profound mechanism for giving you a motivation to tell the truth, to become trustworthy and to stay trustworthy. Of course, that starts to slacken, it starts to dilute, to become more dilute, not just when you've got the web or something like that and Facebook, but as soon as people started to live in bigger cities. And that's why, for example, it's something of a preoccupation in Shakespeare, the idea of been able to conceal yourself and your faults and your wickednesses in the anonymity of the city became quite an anxiety at the end of about the 15th century, when city life started to take over from country life as a mode of existence. Lots of Shakespeare's plays depend on disguises. You can disguise yourself if you're in a city. You can't disguise yourself if you're in a village. Everybody says, "What's Fred doing, looking like Bert or something?" But if you're in a city, you could. You can pretend to be something you're not. And if you're not likely to get caught, and you practice it and you don't get caught, then the mechanism of shame will be correspondingly weaker. You won't feel ashamed about. You don't generally feel ashamed about things you get away with. You feel ashamed at the point at which you're caught, and then you try and hide yourself. So the regulatory function of shame could be thought to be weaker now. And of course, if there's no shame attached to lying, then the whole idea that somebody is actually making a real assertion intended as true, that starts to weaken, and you start to see them as it were, persona in a play, as play acting, or as simply mimicking the activity of making assertions at all. There was a spokesman for Saddam Hussein in the era before the first Iraq War in 2003, who became notorious on British television. I don't know whether he was widely available in Sweden, but he told the most outrageous lies, or if you thought he was telling lies at all. And eventually became known as Comical Ali. The name was Ali, because it became, as it were, possible, and indeed common, just to regard him as a sort of almost a pantomime figure put out by Saddam Hussein to stop people from taking anything seriously. He became sort of something like a court joker, Comical Ali. Russia's getting into the same position, particularly since the Salisbury poisonings. The Russian ambassador constantly comes out with alleged misinformation, but it becomes much harder to hear him as saying things at all, as making assertions. He just makes it up as he goes along. It becomes the kind of reaction. And I think at the point where you're thinking that about somebody, you're thinking of them more as a character in a play, as pretending to make assertions, rather than actually asserting anything at all. So you begin to listen to people with not just skepticism, but with a kind of reinterpretation of the activity that they're going in for. It's as if they no longer intend you to believe what they say. They're going through a ritual or a play, a performance, pantomime, and that's the appropriate reaction to their sayings. And then you might admire their ingenuity or laugh at the absurdity or whatever action you like. But belief or disbelief is not in question, and that means they've stopped making assertions at all. So, in fact, it's quite a real question in Britain at present. Why does the Russian ambassador go on doing this? He knows nobody believes it. He knows there's no credibility attached to anything he says. So, what does he think the point of saying it is? And you start to reinterpret what he's doing as sort of performing an action in a play of some sort. Of course, it's very serious for all that. It's not just play acting. So the decline of shame, I think, is a worrying thing. And of course, insofar as people feel less shame about lying or being caught out with dishonesty, then of course they become more untrustworthy. So the moral issue of whether you feel shame about being caught very much interacts with the original epistemological issue about whether you can be regarded as trustworthy or not. If somebody is incapable of shame, then there's no particular reason or there's a great loss of reason for regarding them as trustworthy. And that was the situation, for example, that Tony Blair got himself into, and that Donald Trump revels in, I think. Okay, so all those are things. The last idea that I thought was perhaps being floated by the idea of post-truth was that some virus, or something that people are suspicious of, called postmodernism, had a hand in a kind of epistemological nihilism. That is, rather like skepticism. It's an attitude that really denies any sense of notions like objectivity, reason, knowledge, and perhaps eventually truth itself. I call this epistemological nihilism rather than skepticism. I think skepticism, properly speaking, preserves those notions. Say there is such a thing as objectivity, there is such a thing as reason, there is such a thing as truth, but claims that it's very difficult to know when you're faced with them. That in some sense the status is one that's very difficult and perhaps impossible to achieve. So if you think of the problem posed by the malingénie at the beginning of Descartes' Meditations, leaving it impossible for us to know whether we're in a virtual reality or not. Reality simply generated in our minds by devices quite unlike the external world we take ourselves to live in. If you take that possibility seriously, then you think, oh my golly, I really need to know whether I'm in an external world of the kind I take myself to be in, surrounded by people, in a room, in a city called Lund, in a country called Sweden, or whether I'm a brain in a vat, or a disembodied mind of some sort, which is just fed a stream of ideas by some source I can't even conjecture, and the whole thing is a virtual reality. Well, if you take that scenario, or those possibilities seriously, I'm not saying you should, but if you do, then you'll think, well, there is such a thing as knowledge. It's possible. It would be nice to know, and unfortunately I can't. And that's skepticism. Descartes, of course, thought eventually he had an escape route, but it was a fairly rubbish escape route, so most people haven't taken it too seriously. So it's possible to think that those notions retain their identity, you understand what's meant by them, but you're worried about finding them. That's, I think, skepticism. What I mean by epistemological nihilism is more the notion that that those concepts have fled, like the great god Pan, they're dead. And I think that was an element in postmodernism, which certainly took a kind of hold towards the final decades of the 20th century. And again, Orwell was prescient about this. He said, this is a kind of thing, peculiarity of the totalitarian state is that though it controls thought, it doesn't fix it. It sets up unquestionable dogmas and it alters them from day to day. It needs the dogmas because it needs absolute obedience from its subject, but it can't avoid the changes which are dictated by the needs of power politics. It declares itself infallible and at the same time it attacks the very concept of objective truth. So Orwell saw that as kind of split in the totalitarian idea. And I think Donald Trump is a perfect example of that. He's not a totalitarian. He is bound by the American Constitution. But he doesn't mind being absolutely certain that Kim Jong-un is a dangerous warmongering moron 1 minute, and being absolutely certain that he's worth talking to the next minute, and then being absolutely certain that he's not the next minute, and absolutely certain that he is the next. And without any kind of shame, and without any kind of awareness that there's something odd about that kind of dynamic. So I think that that's an example. Orwell was more interested actually in Stalin than Hitler at that time, I think, because he'd seen what the communists did with their propaganda in the Spanish Civil War. Well, I think postmodernism does have something to answer for here. So I'll just give a very brief account of what I see as the fundamental elements of it as far as this goes. Of course, postmodernism was a kind of cultural movement which had ramifications far beyond any philosophy. It was a movement which involved architecture, it involved art, it involved things like pastiche and kitsch in artistic production, and so on. So it emphasized a certain kind of playfulness and lack of seriousness in all sorts of directions. But as far as truth goes, these are the issues which I think I could make prominent, I would make prominent. First of all is the emphasis on different perspectives. That's sometimes called relativism. A lot of postmodernists dislike that, but still there is an emphasis on the idea that different people come to things with different subjectivities, and because of those different subjectivities they're going to see things differently, they're going to react to them differently, they're going to be motivated differently, and there's no authoritative, as it were, referee holding the ring saying which one is right. There's just the clash of various subjectivities. I think there's an emphasis on the difficulties in any notion of a given. Let me contrast postmodernism with a kind of optimistic view, a rather scientific view, scientifically optimistic view, which perhaps was prominent in analytical philosophy really until the 50s at least, but which then started to give way. It started to give way in the writings of people like Thomas Kuhn in the philosophy of science, and other people problematizing the notion of the given. Wilfrid Sellers in 1956, I think it was, wrote a famous article called The Myth of the Given, and the article was called Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, but the phrase the myth of the given was a central theme in that. The idea is that observation is never passive and is never innocent. Observation is an active interpretation of a scene, and is only to be made by a prepared mind. You can see the sort of thing that's involved if you think of observations which is quite difficult to make. I don't know, is bird watching a major leisure activity in Sweden? No? None of you are bird watchers? So. Okay. Well, if you're a bird watcher, even a very moderate ability, you go out there into the tundra, or whatever Sweden has, and you get out your binoculars and look. And often you get a glimpse. And then if you're a very experienced bird watcher, you might be able to say, oh, that was a Siberian chiffchaff. Right? If you're an inexperienced bird watcher, you say, oh, that was a bird. Right? And the more effort and energy and thought you put into it, the better you get at it. But it's a process. And when you've got the prepared mind, when you've gone through the process, you're an experienced observer, you can make observations that other people can't make. You become much better at seeing what's in front of you, or hearing if you do it by auditory means, which many bird watchers do. And you can tell what's going on in your ecology in ways that other people can't. Again, if you're trained as a radiologist in a hospital, you can look at an X-ray sheet and say, oh my golly, there's a tumour, whereas the rest of us can only see patterns of black and white and grey. So you learn to look, you learn to see, but it's a process. And of course, people are going to be differently prepared. So you're going to come to the same scene with different preparation, therefore different abilities, different capacities to categorize or to describe what it is that you see. So it's not that the facts are given to you. The facts are things that you interpret the scene as presenting to yourself. But one person's interpretation might be different from another's. So again, you get the emphasis on the lack of the given is a way of emphasizing that the issue of different perspectives goes all the way down. Along with that, you might worry about the existence of so-called crucial experiments in science. The idea behind the crucial experiment is you've got two theorists, one of them holds theory A, the other one holds theory B. They come along to the crucial experiment and it decides whether the results are as A would have predicted or as B would have predicted, and then everybody goes away in agreement. And that's a nice, simple epistemological model, but it's very, very seldom met with, because what tends to happen is that the disagreement goes all the way down, even down to disagreement about what was said or shown by the scene, by the figures, by the facts, by the measurements. I think it was William Harvey, scientist who discovered the circulation of blood in about 1610, I think it was, something around then. Does anybody know a better date? Anyhow, it's the beginning of the 17th century. And you'd think that, to us, the circulation of blood is such a common sense idea, it's almost unbelievable that anybody ever contested it. But Harvey said the opponents of the idea never altered their minds, they just died out. And so that's, as it were, a pessimistic take on the idea of the crucial experiment. And I think people don't alter their minds, they do just die out. I think postmodernism, along with the light-hearted element, which I mentioned in connection with things like art and architecture, kitsch and so on, took a sort of ironic attitude to the fact that even our own current best vocabularies might change, they might become ridiculed in the future, they might become lost, they might be overtaken by new ways of describing and seeing things. So that's a skeptical thought about the permanence of our own categories and our own ways of thinking about things. There's also, I'm not going to talk much about this, an emphasis on dismantling dichotomies. I've already suggested that the observation theory dichotomy was getting problematic by the 1950s. Actually, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote, I think, his famous book in 1962, I think, he was preceded, there was a Polish historian of biology called Ludwig Fleck, who in the 1930s wrote describing what he called the formation of groupthink. That's Orwell's term, but it's basically what he called a Denkstil, a style of thought, which would characterize groups of scientists at a certain time. And then a Denkstil would suddenly give way to a different Denkstil. And this was not a process of refutation or process of observation, it was a process of a change of style of thought. And that's very like Kuhn's idea of a paradigm change, paradigm shift, which he thought also characterized sort of moments of cataclysm, moments of upheaval in the history of science. So observation theory dichotomy, fact-value dichotomy, The idea is that these, as it were, give way to a rather more homogeneous conception of language. And of course there was the emphasis on the practical and political functions of language. So for example, you get that especially in Michel Foucault. And Foucault thinks that the emphasis on the influence of power, of society and power on the way we describe things is usually given a bad press. It's something you have to avoid, and that's basically what I said earlier on in this lecture. But he thinks it's so pervasive that you've got to give it a sort of grudging recognition. We must cease once and for all to describe the effects of power in negative terms. It excludes, it represses, it censors, it abstracts, it masks, it conceals. These are rather odd in English, I don't know about in French. In fact, power produces. It produces reality, it produces domains of objects and rituals of truth. The individual and the knowledge that may be gained of him belong to this production. Well, this is a rather French sort of style of writing philosophy. It's not my own preferred idiom. But what he's suggesting is that while the examples of power, you think, I mean, when I showed you, for example, the inflation of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, you might think, oh, well, that's commercial power, that's the power of the psychiatric profession trying to make a feather bed for itself. But that's a very specific kind of thing, and it's repressing other ways of describing childhood naughtiness and validating its own ways of describing them. But this is A, negative, and B, rather local. And Foucault's saying instead, well, you mustn't think like that. You must think it's not always negative, and it's certainly not always local. It's everywhere. Every category you use will have been moulded by in a sense, a social or political purpose, including the categories that you think just come straight from observation. I don't know whether that's true, but that's the postmodernist suggestion. Okay, I think these things came to a head, these themes in postmodernism, in the work of Richard Rorty, notably in 1980, one in the Philosophy of the Mirror of Nature, a famous book, and Rorty is probably the place that people go to find, as it were, what's thought of as one of the major impacts of postmodernism in analytical philosophy, and in connection with notions like truth, objectivity, reason, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that Rorty was what I called an epistemological nihilist. I don't think it's right to call him a skeptic. I don't even think it's right to call him a relativist, at least as relativism is defined as in terms of different people holding different truths. It's nearer the truth to describe Rorty as counselling the abandonment of notions like objectivity, reason, knowledge, and truth itself. So that's the background which I myself felt I could present, could, as it were, add to the Oxford definition, or the Oxford worries about post-truth climate. I think there was a real worry. There is a real worry that these movements in the philosophy of science and the philosophy, and the other movements I'm going to talk about, but even just these, did in some sense unsettle people's feeling that they knew the facts, or that the category of fact even could retain its glamour, its importance. I think they were wrong. I think that these movements were very important and they need to be taken account of, but I don't think they have the entirely destructive effect that was read into them or read out of them. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next 3 lectures. That's 1 hour. Thank you. Questions? There's one up there.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Simon. That was extremely interesting, and wasn't just interesting, but extremely important.
Thank you.
Material that goes well beyond philosophy and just the university life. And it's really in relation to that. I might be sort of actually anticipating where you're going just through your last remarks about the next 3 lectures. So I may be trying to jump the gun exactly. Yeah. But I was wondering, the way your very interesting kind of taxonomy of these overlapping issues. One way of seeing it, I wonder what you think about this, would be to see it as there's 2 things going on. Both of them are disturbing in a way. One of them is more academic and intellectual, or more of a challenge, and that's, we finished with Rorty here, and it, as you pointed out, it goes long and deep history in Western philosophy, which is skepticism about truth, skepticism about reason, worries of that sort, relativism, and it takes various forms at various times. But the other, that's obviously related to that, and it's a little bit, that's where I want to go with you, is about a kind of nihilism.
Yeah.
You talked about a lack of shame, and that certainly registers with me at all levels. Trump is a kind of reductio of this, a kind of a moral brazen, or lack of immoral brazenness. And I wanted, it's really about that. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between those two, because one view might be that they're both interesting, but they're not particularly
related.
Yes. Another view might be that, in fact, if you want the kind of more intellectualist view, is that, in fact, what's going on is these deeply skeptical views of the philosophers are permeating into society. And then, actually, they're going from being skeptical views about relativism, perspectivism, and so on and so forth, to actually nihilistic views that lead to unethical or lead to these major ethical problems. I wondered if you had any view about that dichotomy and the relationship or priority between them.
That's a very good question, and it certainly it raises it's a question that worries me, and I'm not by profession, of course, a sociologist, so I don't actually like too much speculating about what causes what, because obviously when you've got ideas and the effects they have in society, you're talking really about osmosis, sort of something very intangible which floods people's minds in ways they may not be aware of. Actually, I can just pause there for an aside on something which is very dear to my heart. The research assessment exercise for universities in the United Kingdom. I don't know about the equivalent thing in Sweden, I'm afraid. It's now got a proportion of the marks you get, a mark like school children, set aside for impact. You've got to be able to demonstrate that your ideas have had impact outside academic life. And one of the things that made me tear my hair out is that impact, I mean, that's a metaphor derived from mechanics, derived from billiard ball interactions. You can see one billiard ball hit another, and the other one goes off in a certain direction, and that trajectory is caused entirely by the impact of the first, and that's fine. And car crashes you can talk about in terms of impact and so on. Ideas you can't. Ideas work by osmosis, they don't work by impact. It's a perfectly real physical causal process, but it's not one that's measured in terms of impact. It's one that's measured in terms of the eventual saturation of one solution by what was previously only in another. And it's a process that takes time, and it's a process of which you can't measure individual interactions. So it's just a cumulative, organic sort of process. So it's more like asking which bit of soil was responsible for which bit of the growth of the rose. Doesn't work like that. Anyhow, back to you. Yes, I don't think it's coincidence. I think that the existence of somebody like Trump is, to at least part to be attributed to an atmosphere which was at least aided by some of these movements in thought. Now, the only one I think I mentioned in the talk, but I'd love to try and speculate about others, the only one I mentioned in the talk was the association between lack of trustworthiness and lack of shame. That is, if somebody's incapable of shame, they're incapable of trustworthiness. If you get an atmosphere where more and more things are regarded as untrustworthy, then I think there's less and less shame attached to belonging to the majority, as it were. So when people have lost epistemological caution, when they're prepared to look at Fox News or Breitbart or whatever else it is, there are no doubt equivalent things on the left, and just take what they read for granted as gospel, and indeed become passionately attached to what they read so that opposition becomes criminalized, then I think you can expect someone like Trump. Now, I'm not quite sure why, because it's as if, well, I think it's rather like Orwell. In fact, this is the reason I put up the Orwell slide. Let me go back to it. Sorry. Yes. There's something here which seems, to me, an important insight into the mentality of conviction. That is, the conviction becomes more important than what you're convinced about. So a conviction becomes something like a flag. My country, right or wrong. My Trump believes P or believes not P. It doesn't matter what he believes or what he stands for, what he thinks. I'm just going to hold this flag called Trump. I'm convinced that he's the man. And that's, of course, itself an irresponsible attitude that we think it is. It may answer to a certain need, rather like religions answer to various needs. And there is a sort of religious element to it. There's also a nominalistic element to it, in the sense that the banner has the word Trump on it. That's enough for me. And that's a bit. You can see this in the loyalties of the football fan. Arsenal. You have a little flag saying Arsenal. It can change its ground. It can change its manager. It changes its players. It can change the colours of it plays in. Still Arsenal. It doesn't matter. And just as the identity of a club can be as fluid and changing and contradictory, if you like, as you like, and yet people will still wave its flag. So the Trump character, or the dictator, can say one thing one minute, one the next, and people will still wave the flag. I don't know whether that arises from epistemological pessimism, that we can't know the truth, so we might as well nail our colours to one mast or another, or not. It's certainly a very dangerous human phenomenon, and of course one that religions have for centuries preyed upon. It's just now we've got secular religions. That's a very good, very interesting question. I wish I knew more about the various dynamics that one might try to identify. Thank you.
I have two more over here.
Thank you.
Oh,
There were two things I was wondering about. So one is I'd like to defend a little this definition, Oxford's definition of post-truth, because I think that what you said now, that the role of conviction replacing the issues of fact is something that is sort of...
it's there, isn't it?
pointed out in a way. So this, when it talks about personal belief, maybe what is meant is precisely kind of the appeal to convictions. Though, right?
Yes.
But the other thing is that, well, in related to Paul's question, how does it relate to epistemological nihilism? In a way, there's some kind of inconsistency here, because, as you pointed out, that there is what characterizes many postmodernists is a kind of irony, kind of feeling, well, nothing is serious, right? Because everything is really built on sand, right? Yes. But this strong conviction, right? Even though they kind of change from one moment to another, well, they don't really go together with this kind of ironical way of looking at the world. So, I think that there may be different inspirations to those.
That's right. That's very interesting, Blodek. Tomorrow, I keep saying next week. I like to think of myself as having a week to prepare a lecture. I'm going to show an interesting example of this in action from before Rorty's time, actually. I think it may just be that with a kind of animal such that nihilism is insupportable. People need convictions. But if you have epistemological nihilism, then you can form whichever convictions you like. There's no shame in becoming a flat earther or believing that the earth is 6,000 years old, as 40% of Americans do or something. Believing that people coexisted with dinosaurs. So you get, my right to hold that is just as great as your right to hold that the Earth is 14 billion years old, because we've lost the idea of an authority, the authority of science or the authority of truth, objectivity, reason, observation. G.K. Chesterton, an English author of beginning of the 20th century, he said something which has taken me a lifetime to realize was quite wise. He said the problem about atheism is not that people believe nothing, but that they'll believe anything. And I think that was quite I was an atheist myself. I thought that was a nonsense remark from a Roman Catholic, which he was. But there's an element of truth in it, I think, that if people become lost or bewildered, they become more in need of somebody who lays down certainties. And it just happens that the populist politicians, aided no doubt by various economic and social circumstances, have filled the gap. So I think perhaps seeing clutching at convictions as a result of a vacuum is perhaps a very human dynamic. In which case the postmodernists have quite a lot to answer for. We philosophers are dangerous.
You just touched upon the question I had. I had a question about religion.
Oh yes.
If our trouble with truth has something to do with, is it a symptom of a Nietzschean death of God culture, do you think? I mean, also in science, the scientists, they work bravely for years. I think of back Kepler and Newton. They were wrestling with numerical data for years, believing that there was some pattern in them. It made sense that we can understand reality, and that belief in God is part of a transcendent setting within which to conduct our lives and science, and it's like making a crossword without you wouldn't do a crossword for years without believing that there was a solution to it.
Right. Well, of course, I believe, as a matter of fact, that the enterprise of finding regularities in nature, extrapolable regularities and causal regularities, which enable us to interfere with things, manufacture things, design things, produce things, I believe that that's a self-standing activity. It makes sense on its own without a theological backing. I quite agree that historically, lots of people like Newton especially, was more keen on theology than on science. He saw himself as working within a theological context. He was finding out the mind of God. That belief, I don't think, was integral to the enterprise, because I think its benefits, its achievements and its benefits are self-standing. They don't require a religious framework. But of course, when people get into the habit of kicking authority, whether it's the authority of the church, the authority of their the priest, or the authority of their own conscience, or the authority of the scientist, then that's leaving them in the vacuum we've talked about, and then anything might happen. The worry is that, as Chesterton said, they'll believe anything. So I think one of the most important educational tasks which philosophers ought to play a role in directing is teaching children sort of elementary epistemology. That is, not just elementary statistical reasonings, but the ability to sort of at least make, quite simple moves on estimating the likelihood of the things they're being taught or told, or the things they're reading on the web or whatever. I wouldn't counsel teaching children the full mathematics of Bayes' theorem, but they can learn that when there's a story comes along, there's the question of how probable they'd have thought it in advance, how well it accords with what they've been hearing, and what the probability is of this story having arisen not because it's true, but because of some other reason. And, just keeping those three pieces on the board is a very big piece of epistemology to get hold of. So I think that educators certainly have a role in trying to stem the rush of nonsense which fills the vacuum that the epistemological nihilism has left.
So, thank you very much for the talk. So I definitely agree with what you're saying, but I was thinking perhaps there is an additional aspect which is perhaps tied to the way we consume information, or most people consume information, which is basically in terms of simplification. So everything boils down to for or against, or and the truth is not simple; it's complex.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could maybe tie a few words to that.
Good. Yes, that's an aspect I didn't raise, but you're absolutely right. Of course, the desire for simplification, or the need for simple formulae, simple slogans. That's something I didn't highlight, and perhaps I should have. It certainly plays a very important role, obviously, in populist politics. I think Orwell probably himself had it in mind when he talked about the debasement of the vocabulary, that if you boil it down to, work is good, boss is bad, you've just got such a simplistic take on social affairs that it's absolutely hopeless. But it's an antagonistic take on social affairs, and to that extent politically important and politically dangerous. So yes, I think there's a you know, the desire for simplification does play a role here, and I should probably have highlighted it. Oh, thank you. Yes.
Hi.
There's a lady here. Okay.
So we have
Yeah.
kind of a list.
Lots of people.
So I was thinking about this, like, okay, so in part there's people who want to impose some sort of opinion on others by any means necessary, or perhaps within some limitations. And then there's the people who has the possibility of having some sort of self-defense mechanism against this
position.
and of course, if we don't have any self-defense mechanism at all, then we're going to be very easy to manipulate in any direction. And then I thought about what you said regarding epistemological nihilism as possibly one deficiency of a self-defense mechanism against this sort. But I was wondering if that is just one symptom of a more broad problem with this sort of self-defense mechanism, and that would be the lack of ability or motivation to make progress in questions you discuss with other peers, like with the ones around you, because it's just because someone tells you on the news that something is the case, that opinion probably not going to stick very long if the first person you talk to is going to argue with you extensively and perhaps very proficiently, and so on. So I was thinking, so I was wondering, what role do you think a general lack of motivation or ability to argue in a way to make progress in disagreements of opinions play in this post-truth debate?
Good. It's interesting that while you were talking, I saw a number of women in the audience nodding more vigorously than the men, and I think maybe it's an example of what you're talking about. Might be that the woman might feel that she's not listened to, or epistemologically is bullied, as it were, more readily than men, and that it's difficult to make progress. And then it becomes easier just to throw in the towel, just behave in whatever way is expected of you, and so on. So there's a real political problem there. Yes, I mean there are people who find it very difficult to stand up for themselves, and who find it easy to be browbeaten and somehow suppressed, or not easy perhaps, but find it happening. Just find it happening. It's very. I don't think there's a single solution to that. There's a very there's a metaphor, or not a metaphor, a model, an analogy I used at the end of a book I wrote about truth in 2005, about the way you may need to become assimilated to other people. The analogy is with beekeeping. When a beehive loses its queen, it's due for extinction. It needs a queen. So beekeepers can buy queens. Queens can be, they're bought and sold. They're harvested from previous other hives, but you can't introduce a queen into a new hive directly, because she'll just be alien and killed instantly. So what you've got to do is sugar the pill. You put her in a tube at one end, and the tube is full of sugar, And by the time the workers get at her to kill her, she smells like the hive, and then she's fine. So you've got to have a process of introduction, which is one which, as it were, removes differences. Now, if you find yourself different to other people, it may be very difficult to survive unless you find yourself getting the same camouflage, falling in with the other hive, the other members of the hive, the other members of the tribe.
Excuse me,
yes.
but I don't think the important thing here is that a lot of people feel the need to adapt their own beliefs in accordance to what the other person is saying next to them, perhaps if some sort of authority. But this in the actual discussions people have, when they reach a point where they feel like, okay, here we're not making any progress anymore. I'm just repeating myself. You're just repeating myself. So then maybe, oh, well, that's your opinion. This is my opinion. Epistemological nihilism. Let's go away from here.
Right.
But what to do about that? And what role do you think that plays to the?
I see. I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question, I think. Well, of course, you're absolutely right that there's some debates which are not worth having between some people, maybe because their own resources are limited, because their ability to find common ground is limited, and maybe because they're dogmatic and their ability to walk away is limited. Of course, some debates aren't worth having because they don't need to be settled. So if I think Titian is a greater painter than Rembrandt, and you think Rembrandt is a greater painter than Titian, it doesn't matter. We don't have to agree. You can go to the Dutch, which way was it around, was it? You can go to the Dutch painting gallery and I'll go to the Venetian gallery, and we can meet and have coffee afterwards. There's nothing that needs to be settled. But of course, that's quite rare, because very often we're having the discussion. It could be a discussion just like that, because we're in charge of the budget. We've got to decide whether to buy the Rembrandt or the Titian. Or we've got to decide to go on holiday together. Do we go to Holland, or do we go to the Florence or Venice? And then some sort of accommodation is needed. We don't necessarily have to decide whether Rembrandt's a greater painter than Titian, but we do have to decide where to go on holiday. And that might involve some kind of accommodation. Now, of course, often you say, well, we'll go for 1 week to Holland and 1 week to Venice. But sometimes you can't even find that. So, yes, obviously there's a time to walk away from debates because you just don't have the resources to settle it. Or settle it in a way that your particular opponent will recognise. I mean, I personally, as I've hinted, believe that virtually all the arguments in the United Kingdom worth listening to were on the side of us remaining in the common market or in the European Union. Other people obviously don't believe that. There are some Brexiteers I could have a conversation with, but there's some I just couldn't. There'd be no common ground because their view of the economics and of the dynamics of society and of the importance of sovereignty and all that is so, to me, next door to unintelligible. And then in their mind, my views on the importance of cooperation and the importance of having joint policies with all our neighbours and so on, they'd regard that as wishy-washy, feeble, liberal nonsense. And there's no point in us talking. But it's got to be decided, so you've got a political battle on. And I think it's just an aspect of know-how, possibly wisdom, to know when conversations are not worth having. Sad but true.
I would like to follow up on that, but
okay.
Thank you. I have a question about the first sort of source of the anxiety that you mentioned, this increased lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that in a way this didn't fit with the post-truth idea because it assumed this robust conception of truth.
Right.
But I wonder if, maybe just a kind of thought about how to make it compatible with post-truth.
Sure.
Maybe it's more about a sort of lack of trust in the sense that there's a lack of trust in the authorities and the elites being benevolent and having the voters' interest at heart and so on.
Sure.
So that there's a sense in which truth hasn't done much for us, or the people that sort of represent truth hasn't done much to us. So, let's try something else. Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe the real causes doesn't have to do so much with truth and epistemology, but more with increased inequality. And
right. Good.
Things like that.
Yes. I think that's very likely. I think it's quite likely that some of the rise in populism that we're seeing at present, the Trumps, the Boris Johnson in the UK, and of course Hungary and now Italy and so on, the rise of populism, I think is almost surely, certainly connected with the absence of rise in living standards, coupled with the awareness of the extreme rise in living standards amongst the extremely wealthy. So the idea that elites are not doing anything for us, that doesn't just become attractive, it becomes true. They're not doing very much for us. And faced with that, of course, you do get a kickback, some sort of pushback. To remain trusted, any sort, is likely to need to remain trustworthy. And a lot of people think that the governments of their time, the things they're told and so on, are just not trustworthy. So they refuse to trust them, and away you go. When somebody, when the recent chancellors of the Exchequer told the British people that, their policies of austerity were the way, forward. Well, they might have been believed if it had been obvious that everybody was worse off, more austere. But it's obvious that not everybody was. Not even never mind about the very wealthy, people like myself, pensioners, are better off. But the workers are not. So, it's not the message that everybody's in it together was just a lie, and it's been exploded. So of course you get a kickback. You get, in principle, you get the ground for revolutionary politics, although that hasn't happened yet.
Yes, my question is about personal identity and group belonging and group identity.
Yes.
And how this relates to personal belief. Your opinions about that.
Oh, I see. So what's the question?
Yeah, basically, how does these two relate? Do you see any connection or...
personal identity and social identity?
Yeah, and personal identity. Yeah, and personal belief too.
I don't think there's a short answer to that. I mean, one of my favourite quotations is from the early 20th century Oxford philosopher R.G. Collingwood. It's not very much read these days. But Collingwood had a wonderful statement. I won't be able to quote it accurately, but it goes something like this. The child's discovery of itself as a person is a discovery of itself as a persona. That is, somebody who can listen and speak. So it is at the same time the discovery of other people. So the idea is that an awareness of your own identity is, as it were, inseparably tied to and inseparably grows with an awareness of other people. So the implication would be that a wolf child or a Robinson Crusoe, a congenital Robinson Crusoe, would not have a sense of personal identity in the way that a social person does, a person who grows up amongst normal other people. Again, I don't know how you'd prove that. I don't know how you'd elaborate it. But it seems to me a very important point that our conception of ourselves is essentially tied to our conception of how other people see ourselves. That's why it's so miserable to feel ashamed, because you're aware that other people are holding you in contempt, and that makes you miserable, at least if you're normal. If you're President Trump, it might make you just more proud of the fact that you don't care about other people. But that's why he's halfway to being a monster. So, no, I think a personal identity and a social identity are very, very closely tied. A catastrophe to your social life is a catastrophe to your life. Very few people have the courage. That goes along with what I was talking about, the queen and the hive. Very few people have the courage or the ability to stand out against the herd. Maybe they become saints, and maybe they become mad.
But you see a connection between like personal belief that I hold and my personal identity. So in the discussions that has been discussed, do we see our own beliefs as part of ourselves, as a part of ourselves?
Yeah.
How does that relate to epistemology?
Well, I think there's a lot of difficulty in this area. One thing I'd like to put on the table is this. I think when people talk about their personal beliefs, it's easy to think that they're describing what you might say is an inner world, or their world, the private world, which they alone have access to. So if I was a schoolmaster, I set you all the essay, write down some of your personal beliefs. It would sound as though the task is then one of inspecting your own minds, finding the belief box, finding what's in the belief box and writing it down. But of course that's not really right. As Gareth Evans pointed out in his book about reference, when you're asked what you believe about something, you're not really asked to inspect your own mind, you're asked to think about the world, about the topic of belief. So what do I believe about what do I believe about Brexit? If you ask that question about me, I answer it by thinking further about Brexit, not about thinking about myself. I think about the economic consequences, the consequences for xenophobia, immigration policy, universities, cooperation on science, and all the other things that seem to me to be very, very heavily and very badly involved. I may not have thought of some of them before, but if you ask me what I believe about Brexit, that's the task, to think about Brexit. If I ask you what you believe about, I mean, it may be that you do know what you believe about something just directly. What do you believe about the shape of the earth? It's spherical, clear enough. You don't have to think about the earth. But if somebody then says, do you really believe that it's spherical? What they're asking is, what would you adduce as an argument against flat earthers, or how big do you think the flattening at the poles is, or something? And then you to think not about what you believe about it, but what's the truth. Is it really flatter at the poles? How much? Miles? Tens of miles? Hundreds of miles? Is it really clear that flat earthers have no arguments? You might start to worry. But really, what do I believe about something strikes me as a subjective gloss on what's usually not a subjective matter. And that's why, in conversation, I think that P, what you're putting on the table is P. I think that English asparagus tastes better than continental asparagus, white asparagus. It does actually. You may not know anything about English asparagus, but if I say I think that, you take it not as an interesting fact about me. You take it as something you might want to experiment on or find out about, whether English asparagus tastes better than continental asparagus. In other words, I think that is not usually a device for changing the topic to me and my internal workings or my hidden mind. It's a way of putting something to be discussed on the table, P, which has need have nothing to do with me. Of course, it could have something to do with me. I think I'm getting overweight, as you know. And I may say that to my wife, and she'll say, "Oh no, Simon, you're looking svelte and slim as you ever did." I think, or something else. Oh yes, sure, yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah, now you can hear me. So, yeah, I intended to ask a very long question, but maybe I'll try to. Yeah, exactly, I know. So, I try to connect different dots in your presentation, and so maybe it's just a clarification question. It will be long, but let me try. So, you started by saying that what's very important. So you started by presenting this definition, and then you said something about classification of different mental diseases that we are having now, and then you said that maybe healthy children, it's a better term to describe children with attention deficit than this categorization that we can use for medical issues, and that might be used by pharmaceutical authorities to, you know, make children a drug addict. I mean, I really sympathize with this observation, but I also have a feeling that calling someone naughty, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly in English, naughty children. It's actually extremely judgmental. So when you are calling someone, oh, you have a, you know, this is what happens to you. This is the disorder. It's maybe not very deep. You maybe not need to be medicalized for that, but it takes away the judgmental part. That was my first impression, and I felt very uncomfortable when you were, you know, trying to advocate the opposite thing. But I kind of understand where you were heading with this reference shift, right? Because that was your objective, right? You just wanted to have an example. So now comes my example that I don't know if it's better, but I think it really fits this post-truth definition. So some time ago, Jimmy Oliver, you know, the Fox chef? News. No, the Fox News presenter. It's James, maybe no. It's like he's he has.
I've never seen Fox News. I only know.
Oh yeah, but you should see this one because he's holding a very popular show on Fox News, and he's speaking about politics, about different. I actually googled Jimmy Oliver to make sure that this is not the chief. So it might be a different. It might be James. No, it's not James. Yeah, whatever. But anyhow, so he has this extremely popular show, And he was speaking some time ago, he was raising a problem of scientific communication. Because he was saying, okay, so we are hearing in the news that we should eat chocolate because that will make us healthy. But then the day after, and this is based on some scientific research, and then after you will hear that you should not eat chocolate because it will make you unhealthy, and this is based again on some scientific research. And he was giving many examples of how media make people believe things, and then people take actions on it without really knowing, right? So your distinction between belief and knowledge, from what I understand, is that belief is a sufficient for action taking, right? You don't need to know, but if you know, you might want to take action as well, right? I mean, this is how I understood you. But so the belief was put in the center. And at some point, I got interested in that, and I was looking at how the how the information about from Northwestern University, where they discovered that at the moment of the egg fertilization of the mice gets fertilized, there is a very visible lightening reaction of zinc and something else. And then it was communicated as life starts with light. And then it was communicated this way by New Yorker and some other important magazines. And it ended up with the same information at ultra-Catholic organization saying we have a proof of God. And we have a proof that actually life is something extremely precious because it starts with light. So this is what people believe, right? I mean, you could see from very complex scientific paper. Yeah. So I think that I finished. But
okay. So the question is.
No, the question is like how all those things relate. I mean, how you relate the post-truth with the HD, and then this shift in meaning that you can observe in the news.
Okay. I'll just say a couple of things. One is I do apologise if naughty treads on anybody's toes. I mean, a naughty child is just a child who's disruptive, doesn't do what they're told in classroom and so on. It may be the classroom's fault as much as the child's. I'm not judging about that. But it's I just used it as a neutral term. If it treads on your toes, then just say a disruptive child, a child that disrupts the classroom or other people or something. As far as the example from Fox News goes, I mean, what gets produced in the science columns of the media is often far removed from anything that scientists at work in various fields would recognise. It's simplified to take up that problem, and it's often exaggerated, and it's often one-sided. So they publish the alleged result, but then the newspaper doesn't publish the retraction, which comes when it's peer-reviewed or when somebody else tries to duplicate the experiment or when other people look at it. So you get a constant stream of chocolate's good for you, chocolate's bad for you, chocolate's good for you, chocolate's bad for you. The other thing, of course, about that kind of reportage is there's a huge difference between the experiments which are conducted by scientific groups who are funded by, in this case, the chocolate industry, and scientific groups who are not. It's well established across many domains of that kind that you get the results you pay for, basically, because scientists need support, they need funding, they can't afford to kick sponsors in the mouth. They're not necessarily consciously dishonest, but it's surprising how unconscious bias can come in. The science writer, I'm blanking on his name. There's a science writer in the UK who said that a meta-study of 52 studies of painkillers by medical research groups found that in all cases, all the 52 cases, the painkiller sold by the company sponsoring the research came out as the best. So that is the motivation or the need to show that the guy sponsoring your research has the best product worked in all 52 cases.
But this is the post-truth, right? This is how you defined post-truth.
No, this is the lack of trustworthiness. This just means that kind of experiment doesn't produce results you can trust, because the motivation has been at work affecting the alleged observations, the alleged science, the way that the reports of people who've taken these painkillers are interpreted. All that overrides whatever there may be in the different merits of different painkillers. It's like a lot of people, I know quite intelligent people who say that Bayer aspirin is the best kind of aspirin. It's not, it's aspirin. Aspirin is a term for a chemical. Bayer aspirin is no different from any other aspirin except you've got the word Bayer on it. And it's that kind of difference which we're talking about. Anyhow, we've gone beyond time, I'm afraid.
So we are running a bit late. I have one more question.
Oh, yes, okay.
If you need to go, I think you are allowed to. But a quick question and a quick answer.
Thank you for this talk. I wonder, do you think that epistemological nihilism is necessarily a bad thing? Because Rorty had this idea that if we give up on truth as correspondence, then we might assimilate truth talk to cultural politics. We might start having these, like Dewey had this idea of interfaith communication and stuff like that. Yeah. And he of course saw a progressive agenda and stuff like that. So good things would follow if we gave up on truth. So.
I'm glad this is the last question, because I'm going to be talking about exactly that tomorrow. So please come back.
I'm looking forward to it.